July 1943. Kursk. German Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt crouched in his trench watching the sky with dread he'd learned to feel over 2 years of Eastern Front combat. The sound reached him before he saw them, a distinctive, throaty roar of liquid-cooled engines that every German soldier had learned to recognize and fear. Then they appeared, black shapes flying low over the battlefield, so low their shadows raced across the ground ahead of them. The IL-2 Sturmoviks came in groups of 8, flying at altitudes where German fighters couldn't effectively intercept, and anti-aircraft guns struggled to track. Schmidt watched them approach the German tank assembly area behind his position and knew what was coming. The aircraft didn't dive dramatically like German Stukas. They flew nearly level, releasing rockets and bombs with methodical precision, then strafing with cannon fire as they passed over targets. The German Panzer IVs and Panthers that had seemed invulnerable minutes earlier erupted in flames as rockets struck. The armor that protected them from Soviet anti-tank guns couldn't stop the top-down attack from aircraft specifically designed to destroy armored vehicles. Within 3 minutes, the tank assembly area was burning. 12 armored vehicles were destroyed or damaged. And the IL-2s were already banking away, their armor shrugging off the light flak that German gunners managed to throw at them. Schmidt had seen this pattern countless times. The IL-2s would appear whenever German forces concentrated armor or vehicles. They would attack with devastating effectiveness. German fighters that tried to intercept discovered the IL-2 was nearly impossible to shoot down. The armor that protected the cockpit and engine made it far more durable than any other ground attack aircraft in service. And there were always more of them. The Soviets produced IL-2s in quantities that seemed endless. This is the story of the Ilyushin IL-2 Sturmovik, the most produced military aircraft in history and the ground attack plane that became symbol of Soviet tactical air power. Over 36,000 were built during the war, more than any other combat aircraft ever manufactured. German soldiers called it the Black Death. Soviet forces called it the Flying Tank. It was designed for one purpose: destroying German ground forces at close range, and it accomplished that mission with industrial efficiency that matched its production numbers. To understand the IL-2, you must understand the Soviet approach to close air support that shaped its design. Soviet military doctrine in the 1930s emphasized combined arms operations, where aviation would directly support ground forces. This wasn't strategic bombing to destroy industry or fighter operations to control airspace. This was tactical aviation intended to function as mobile artillery, destroying specific targets that ground forces identified as obstacles to advance. The requirement was specific: an aircraft that could attack ground targets while surviving intense defensive fire. Traditional bombers were vulnerable to anti-aircraft guns and fighters. Fighters could strafe ground targets, but lacked the weapons to destroy armored vehicles effectively, and had insufficient protection against ground fire. What was needed was an armored attack aircraft that could absorb punishment while delivering weapons specifically designed to destroy tanks, vehicles, and fortifications. Designer Sergey Ilyushin approached the problem by building the aircraft around an armored shell. Rather than adding armor plates to a conventional aircraft structure, he created an armored bathtub that served as the structural center of the aircraft. The pilot sat inside this armor shell. The engine was protected by it. The fuel tanks were located within it. The armor wasn't supplementary protection, it was the aircraft's primary structure. This was revolutionary and unprecedented in aviation design. The armor thickness ranged from 5 to 13 depending on location. The cockpit floor was 5 steel, sufficient to stop rifle-caliber bullets and shell fragments. The back of the pilot's seat was 13, designed to stop 20 cannon shells from rear attacks. The sides and front received 6 protection. The engine received similar armoring. The total armor weight was approximately 700 kilograms, about 15% of the aircraft's empty weight. No other aircraft devoted this much weight to protection. The armament was specifically chosen for ground attack effectiveness. Two 23 cannons could penetrate light armor and destroy vehicles with explosive shells. Two 7.62 machine guns provided additional firepower against soft targets and personnel. 8 RS-82 or RS-132 rockets could be mounted under the wings, delivering high-explosive warheads against armored vehicles. Bombs up to 600 kilograms total could be carried for attacks on buildings, fortifications, and vehicle concentrations. The design challenges were substantial. An aircraft carrying 700 kilograms of armor plus weapons and fuel had to be powered by engines available to Soviet industry. The Mikulin M38 engine, producing 1,600 horsepower, provided barely adequate power. The result was an aircraft that was slow by fighter standards, maximum speed about 250 miles per hour at low altitude, and unmaneuverable. The IL-2 couldn't dogfight. It couldn't evade determined fighter attacks through aerobatics, but it could survive hits that would destroy conventional aircraft and deliver weapons that could stop armored vehicles. The first IL-2s entered service in May 1941, barely a month before Germany invaded. Initial production was limited because Soviet industry was still building factory capacity and training workers. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, the Soviet Air Force had fewer than 250 IL-2s available, far too few to affect the massive German assault. Most Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground in the war's opening days. The IL-2 units that did engage discovered their tactics were undeveloped, and their coordination with ground forces was poor. The early experiences were harsh lessons. IL-2 pilots flying individually or in small groups were vulnerable to German fighters despite their armor. The rear arc was particularly dangerous. The early single-seat IL-2 had no rear-facing defensive armament. German fighter pilots learned to attack from behind and above, where the IL-2's armor was thinnest. Soviet losses were severe. Many of the experienced pilots who flew IL-2s in the war's opening months were killed before effective tactics could be developed. Stalin's personal interest in IL-2 production elevated the aircraft to highest priority. He sent a famous telegram to factory managers in December 1941, stating that IL-2s were as essential to the Red Army as air and bread. The message was clear: production delays were unacceptable. Factory managers understood that failure to meet production targets could result in execution. The pressure was immense, but it produced results. IL-2 production accelerated even as Soviet industry relocated eastward to escape German advances. The factory evacuations were extraordinary. Aircraft plants in Western Soviet Union were disassembled, loaded onto trains, and moved hundreds of miles east. Workers and their families traveled with the equipment. In some cases, factories resumed production within weeks of arriving at new locations, operating in temporary buildings through Russian winter. The IL-2 production continued despite these massive disruptions, testament to both Soviet industrial determination and the aircraft's relatively simple design. By 1942, IL-2 production was reaching substantial numbers and tactical employment was improving. The introduction of the two-seat variant in September 1942 addressed the rear defense vulnerability. A rear gunner with a 12.7 machine gun could engage fighters attacking from behind, dramatically improving survival rates. The two-seat IL-2 became the standard production variant, and losses to fighter attacks decreased substantially. The tactical doctrine evolved through brutal experience. IL-2s operated most effectively in groups of 8 to 12 aircraft, called the Circle of Death formation. The aircraft would approach targets at low altitude, attack in succession, and depart in a circular pattern that allowed rear gunners to cover each other. German fighters attempting to intercept would face defensive fire from multiple aircraft simultaneously. The formation wasn't invulnerable, but it was far more survivable than individual operations. The coordination with ground forces improved as radio equipment became more available and procedures were established. Soviet ground commanders could request air support through forward air controllers who would direct IL-2 strikes against specific targets. The response time wasn't as fast as later close air support systems, but it was effective enough that German forces learned to disperse when IL-2s appeared. The psychological impact of the attacks was as significant as the physical damage. The Battle of Stalingrad in late 1942 and early 1943 demonstrated improved IL-2 effectiveness. Soviet forces had sufficient numbers to maintain continuous pressure on German positions. IL-2 strikes disrupted German logistics, destroyed armor concentrations, and supported Soviet infantry attacks. The aircraft's ability to operate from rough forward airfields, close to the front lines, meant rapid turnaround between sorties. Pilots would fly multiple missions daily, rearming and refueling at primitive strips that would have been unusable for more sophisticated aircraft. The tank-killing capability became legendary, but was more complex than propaganda suggested. The 23mm cannon could penetrate light armor and destroy vehicles from the sides or rear, but frontal armor on German medium and heavy tanks was generally proof against it. The rockets were effective, but required accurate aim at moving targets, which was difficult. The reality was that IL-2s were most effective against soft-skinned vehicles, supply concentrations, and artillery positions. Actual tank destruction numbers were lower than Soviet claims suggested, but the disruption to German armored operations was real and significant. The Kursk battle in July 1943 saw IL-2 employment at its peak effectiveness. The Soviets concentrated hundreds of ground attack aircraft to support defensive operations, then offensive counterattacks. German forces advancing into prepared Soviet defenses faced continuous IL-2 strikes that disrupted formations, destroyed supplies, and forced German armor to disperse. The cumulative effect over weeks of combat was that German offensive capability was systematically degraded by air attacks that German air defenses couldn't prevent. German attempts to counter the IL-2 evolved through the war. Fighter tactics emphasized attacking from the rear quarter, aiming for the engine and tail where armor was thinner. Specialized anti-aircraft artillery in 37 and larger calibers could penetrate IL-2 armor if hits were achieved, but the aircraft's low-altitude operations and speed made it a difficult target. German fighters diving to intercept at low altitude were vulnerable to Soviet fighters flying top cover. The loss exchange rate generally favored the IL-2, particularly when operating in formation with fighter escort. The production numbers were staggering and unprecedented. In 1942, Soviet factories produced over 8,200 IL-2s. In 1943, the number exceeded 11,000. Peak production in 1944 reached approximately 10,500. The total production during the war exceeded 36,000 aircraft, more than the combined production of all American heavy bombers, more than total German fighter production, more than any other single aircraft type from any nation during any period. The scale reflected both Soviet industrial capacity and the aircraft's tactical importance. The pilot experience in the IL-2 was grueling and dangerous. Missions were flown at altitudes where the aircraft was constantly exposed to ground fire. The targets, German armor, artillery, supply columns, were always defended. The sortie rate was high, with pilots flying multiple missions daily during intensive operations. The physical stress of repeated low-altitude operations, combined with psychological stress of constant exposure to defensive fire, created fatigue that affected performance and increased losses. The survival rate for IL-2 crews was sobering. The aircraft was tough, but the mission was inherently dangerous. Soviet sources acknowledge that average IL-2 pilot life expectancy during intensive combat was measured in weeks or months, not years. Some pilots survived dozens or hundreds of missions through skill and luck. Many died on their first few missions. The two-seat variant meant that rear gunners faced the same risks, with the added vulnerability of sitting in a less protected position. Anna Yegorova, one of the few female IL-2 pilots, flew 277 combat missions during the war. Her account describes the experience. Every mission you could die. The ground fire was constant. Sometimes you'd return and count 50 or more holes in your aircraft. The armor saved you, but only if the hits were in protected areas. If a shell hit the wing or tail, armor didn't matter. You accepted that death was probable and flew anyway because the mission was essential. The maintenance burden on ground crews was substantial. IL-2s returned from missions with battle damage that required extensive repair. Holes from shell fragments had to be patched. Damaged control surfaces had to be replaced. The engine, stressed by low-altitude combat operations, required frequent maintenance. The ground crews worked around the clock to keep aircraft operational, often in primitive conditions at forward airfields. Their work was as critical as the pilot's courage in maintaining operational capability. The specialized variants demonstrated Soviet willingness to adapt the basic design for specific missions. The IL-2T was modified for anti-shipping strikes, carrying torpedoes for naval targets. The IL-2M3 incorporated improved aerodynamics and weapons. Experimental versions carried 37 cannon for enhanced armor penetration, though these were heavy and difficult to aim accurately. The two-seat configuration became standard, then was refined continuously through the production run. The comparison with German ground attack aircraft highlights different design philosophies. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka was more accurate in dive bombing, but lacked the IL-2's armor and was vulnerable to fighters. The Henschel HS-129 was designed specifically for tank destruction, but was produced in limited numbers and suffered reliability problems. The Focke-Wulf FW-190F fighter bomber was fast and maneuverable, but lacked armor and couldn't absorb damage like the IL-2. None of Germany's ground attack aircraft were produced in numbers approaching IL-2 production. The American comparison is with the A-26 Invader and various fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt configured for ground attack. American aircraft were faster and better armed, but lacked the specific armor protection that defined the IL-2. American doctrine emphasized speed and firepower over protection, reflecting different tactical priorities. The P-47 with its radial engine had good survivability, but achieved this through different design approach than the IL-2's armored bathtub. The strategic impact of IL-2 operations is difficult to quantify precisely. Soviet claims of tanks and vehicles destroyed were certainly inflated, as all wartime kill claims were. But the cumulative effect of thousands of IL-2 sorties over years of combat was that German ground forces operated under constant aerial threat. The disruption to logistics, the forced dispersal of concentrations, the psychological stress on German troops, all contributed to degrading German combat effectiveness even when specific kill numbers were exaggerated. The post-war IL-2 service extended beyond World War II. The aircraft served with Soviet forces through the late 1940s, seeing combat in the Chinese Civil War, where Soviet-supplied IL-2s supported communist forces. North Korea operated them during the Korean War's opening phases before jet aircraft made them obsolete. The robust construction and simple maintenance meant the aircraft could operate from primitive bases long after more sophisticated designs would have required extensive support infrastructure. The historical assessment of the IL-2 acknowledges both its effectiveness and its costs. The aircraft accomplished its design mission of providing armored ground attack capability. The production numbers ensured that Soviet forces had tactical air support throughout the war. The losses were severe, but the tactical impact justified continued production. The armor protection saved pilots who would have died in less protected aircraft, though the inherent danger of the mission meant casualties remained high. The design philosophy represented by the IL-2, building an aircraft around an armored shell, was unique and hasn't been repeated in subsequent aircraft. Modern ground attack aircraft emphasize speed and weapons technology over passive armor protection. The A-10 Warthog incorporates some armor protection around critical systems, but nothing approaching the IL-2's structural integration of armor. The shift reflects changed threat environments and different technological solutions to aircraft survivability. The cultural impact in Soviet and Russian military culture elevated the IL-2 to legendary status. It became symbol of Soviet tactical air power and great patriotic war resistance. Museums display preserved examples. Veterans' memorials feature IL-2 monuments. The aircraft's nickname, Flying Tank, captured the essence of its design philosophy and became source of pride. Post-Soviet Russia has maintained this reverence, with the IL-2 appearing in military parades and commemorations. The production achievement deserves recognition separate from combat effectiveness. Building 36,000 complex aircraft while relocating factories, training workers, and fighting a war of national survival represents industrial accomplishment of highest order. Soviet aircraft industry in 1941 was less sophisticated than German or American equivalents. By 1944, it was producing more ground attack aircraft than both combined. The IL-2 production was central to this transformation. The tactical lessons from IL-2 operations influenced post-war close air support doctrine internationally. The emphasis on coordination with ground forces, the value of dedicated ground attack aircraft, the importance of pilot protection. All lessons from IL-2 experience shaped how other nations approached tactical aviation. The specific design approach wasn't copied, but the mission concept and tactical employment informed military thinking globally. For German ground forces, the IL-2 became symbol of Soviet numerical superiority and industrial capacity. German soldiers knew that destroying one IL-2 was meaningless when dozens more would appear. The endless supply of Soviet ground attack aircraft demonstrated the material disparity that Germany couldn't overcome. The psychological impact of knowing that any concentration of vehicles would attract IL-2 attack affected German tactical decisions throughout the war. The armorer's perspective on the IL-2 was that it was weapon system optimized for its specific mission at the cost of all other considerations. It wasn't fast, wasn't maneuverable, wasn't comfortable, wasn't easy to maintain. But it was durable, it was producible in vast numbers, it could deliver weapons that destroyed ground targets, and it could survive damage that would destroy conventional aircraft. These characteristics were precisely what Soviet forces needed for tactical air support. The comparison with strategic bombing doctrine highlights different approaches to air power. Western allies emphasized strategic bombing to destroy enemy industrial capacity. Soviets emphasized tactical aviation to support ground operations directly. Neither approach was inherently superior. They reflected different strategic circumstances and operational requirements. The IL-2 was product of Soviet emphasis on tactical operations and couldn't have emerged from strategic bombing-focused doctrine. The pilot training pipeline for IL-2 crews became increasingly efficient as the war progressed. Initial training took months and produced relatively few qualified pilots. By 1943, training was accelerated and standardized, producing larger numbers of adequately trained pilots even if individual skill levels were lower than earlier in the war. The emphasis shifted from producing exceptional pilots to producing sufficient numbers of competent pilots who could operate the aircraft safely and deliver weapons effectively. The female pilots and crews who flew IL-2s faced prejudice and skepticism, but generally proved as capable as male crews. Soviet forces employed women in combat aviation more extensively than any other nation, and some female pilots accumulated impressive combat records. Their presence challenged assumptions about women's capabilities in combat and demonstrated that physical requirements for flying ground attack aircraft didn't exclude women from effective service. The tactical flexibility of IL-2 employment evolved continuously. Early war operations emphasized direct support of specific ground attacks. Mid-war operations included interdiction missions against German supply lines and reserves. Late war operations incorporated reconnaissance and coordination roles where IL-2s would identify targets for artillery or mark targets for other aircraft. The basic platform proved adaptable to various tactical requirements beyond its original design intent. Supply chain supporting IL-2 operations was massive. Each aircraft required fuel, ammunition, rockets, bombs, all of which had to be transported to forward airfields and distributed to aircraft. The maintenance spare parts, tools, and replacement components had to be available despite the aircraft operating from primitive bases. Soviet logistics capability, often underestimated, successfully maintained IL-2 operations at scales that strained German supply networks throughout the war. The propaganda value of the IL-2 to Soviet morale should not be underestimated. Soviet citizens and soldiers knew that IL-2s represented Soviet aviation striking back against German forces. The aircraft appeared in posters, newsreels, and publications as symbol of Soviet counteroffensive capability. The psychological boost to Soviet morale from knowing their forces possessed effective tactical air support contributed to sustaining resistance through the war's darkest periods. When Oberjefreitor Schmidt watched IL-2s destroy German tanks at Kursk in July 1943, he was witnessing the culmination of Soviet industrial mobilization and tactical air power development. The aircraft that attacked his position represented thousands of similar aircraft operating across the Eastern Front. Each one was protected by armor that German ground fire struggled to penetrate. Each one carried weapons specifically designed to destroy the vehicles and equipment German forces depended on, and each one was just one of thousands that Soviet factories would produce. The IL-2 Sturmovik was Stalin's flying tank, slow, heavily armored, purpose-built for ground attack, and produced in numbers that overwhelmed German defenses through sheer quantity. It wasn't the most sophisticated aircraft of the war. It wasn't the fastest or most maneuverable, but it was exactly what Soviet forces needed. An aircraft that could survive the mission of attacking German ground forces at close range and be produced in quantities sufficient to maintain constant pressure. In achieving these goals, the IL-2 became the most produced military aircraft in history, and a symbol of Soviet tactical air power that German forces learned to fear.